So we're talking about this book, Mother Daughter Murder Night, and you know how in the beginning of most novels it says, no characters are based on real people. Well, in the case of this book, one character is based on a real person, and that is the hero protagonist Lana Rubicon, who is based very directly on my mother. So, this is a book I never expected to write. I've always been an enthusiastic fiction reader, but I never imagined that I would write a novel. When I was I've always loved to write. And so, when I was an electrical engineering student in college, I was a slam poet on the side. And then when I was working in museums, I was writing, of course, exhibit labels, but also writing about museum practice. And I wrote a couple nonfiction books about it. But I really never thought I would write a novel. And then, in the fall of 2020, my life changed very dramatically when my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And it was one of those just clarion moments in life where I just knew what I needed to be doing was to be with her. And I was running this big international arts nonprofit, but I, quit my job to go to LA and to take care of my mom. And what turned out was that my mom, like Lana Rubicon in the story, very tough, funny, type A Jewish businesswoman. And I share some of those characteristics as well. And it turned out that while we were great at making sure that we, got to appointments on time and got what we needed at the hospital, we were not great at the softer sides of caregiving through an incredible health crisis like that. And we needed a project. We needed something else to put energy into because we both had a lot of energy and we were not doing well in the kind of like, let's just lie around and, deal with mortality and watch crap TV kind of version of caring. And so, my mom is the one who introduced me to murder mysteries when I was a kid. And I've always loved to write. And I just turned to her one day and I said, what if I tried writing a murder mystery? And what if I made the main character someone like you? And so Lana Rubicon, like my mom, is this tough LA Jewish businesswoman who gets diagnosed with stage 4 lung and brain cancer, and is forced to move in with her daughter, her estranged daughter and granddaughter, in this crappy cottage up in the Monterey Bay. Now, I should say I never was able to get my actual mom to leave Los Angeles, but it turns out in fiction you can just make people do what you want them to do. And fortunately, my mom and I have never been estranged, and I am like contractually obligated to tell you if you read this book that my mom is much nicer and our relationship is much better than the relationship in the book. But they always say that the relationships you wish for in real life would be deadly boring to read about in novels. So, of course, there had to be some more conflict there. And so, I wrote this entire first draft of this book, not imagining it was for publication. I wrote it just for my mom and me. And I wrote it actually sitting on her bed next to her. So in the mornings, I get up very early. I would go in and I'd sit next to her in bed with my laptop and I would just type these scenes. And I was writing this character, Lana Rubicon, to be this kind of outrageous superhero version of my mom. So while my mom was stuck in bed, I wrote this character, Lana, leaping out of bed to, find the criminals and solve the case. And every morning I would write, and then my mom would wake up, and I would sort of slide the laptop over to her. I'd go make some tea and food, and then she'd read what I'd written. And then we'd spend the rest of the day talking about it, talking about the story. What did we think should happen next? What did she like? What did she not like? And I wrote the whole first draft that way. Lana Rubicon, she's in LA. She is an incredibly independent woman. All three of these women, all three generations, are very independent. And when she gets sick, though, and she has to have brain surgery and go through pretty intense chemo and radiation, which was true for my mom as well, she can't be alone. And so she, begrudgingly agrees to move in with her daughter Beth, who's a nurse, and her granddaughter Jack, who is a kayaking teenager, on the bank of this wetlands preserve called Elkhorn Slough, which is in the Monterey Bay, which is where I live. And I really wanted to have this fish out of water experience where Lana is this very urban woman with her, suits and her Chardonnay and her stilettos, moving to this very beautiful but blue collar and kind of dirty place. And I'm a huge nature girl. I live in the woods, and I wanted to cite this book in a beautiful natural setting, but I also wanted the protagonist to be somebody who really doesn't appreciate the beauty of it, or it takes her a while. Because one of the, from a craft technique perspectives, one of the things I was nervous about as a first-time novelist was that I was going to be overindulgent in giving characters the perspectives I have on the world. And so I felt like if I wrote a main character who felt that the places I thought were so beautiful were grimy and gross, it would kind of be a check on an overindulgent potential for me, and it also encouraged and pushed me to really get to know who this character was, and how she saw the world and how she saw it differently from me. I think I read pretty widely across amateur and detective stories, but one of the things that immediately and suddenly hit me when I started writing this book is that if you have amateur sleuths at the center, they have no jurisdiction. A cop, a homicide detective can go to the medical examiner, can go interview any suspects that they want. An amateur has no standing from which to do that. And so amateur sleuths need a stake in it. And in this case, the stake is that the granddaughter Jack is the one to find the body and is at first a suspect in the murder. But they also need particular skills that they can bring to bear. And because they're amateurs, I needed more than one of them, so that we could spread those skills out, spread the relationships out, so that each person semi-realistically could be going running down different things. Now, also, there's conflict between the three women. At first, it is the grandma Lana and the granddaughter Jack who are doing the sleuthing together, and Beth, the daughter slash mother, is very against it. Eventually, Beth sort of begrudgingly becomes part of the team, and then there's a cop, Detective Ramirez, who sort of they have a love-hate relationship with. And So I wanted each of the amateur sleuths they already had different positionality because of their generation, because of their access to power and wealth, because of their race. Jack is, biracial, and Lana, comes from this very wealthy urban business background. Beth is a nurse, and so when it comes to some of the medical issues, and she has a personal relationship with one of the victims, and then Jack spends a lot of time on the water. And so, I really was able to play with what each of them could do. One of the funny problems, though, about having three detectives is there's a lot cut out of the book from the first draft that was just one of them telling the others what they had found out, because it's sort of like you need for readers propulsive motion forward. But actually, if you have three people, they have to kind of coordinate things. And so that was something I had to work through, and it's something I'm working through in the book I'm working on right now. One of the things I like about amateur sleuths, though, that I will say is on the downside, they don't have jurisdiction. On the positive side, there is no protocol. There are no rules about how they need to operate. And so you don't need to be highly researched in how does that sheriff's department work, or could a cop do this or that in this situation. Amateurs can kind of do whatever they want. And actually, you mentioned Sarah Paretsky. I was on a panel with her recently, and she talked about how one of the reasons she developed her PI character and is because a private investigator actually lives in this liminal space between cops and amateurs. So they are more skilled than amateurs, but they have more leeway and they can do some illegal stuff that cops couldn't do. And I think that that's very interesting and made me think about just the huge ascendancy of the PI in the, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and just how they exist in this, semi-professional space around solving crimes.